Hi, welcome back. This is first track, part 4. In this video, we are going to turn to the book of Revelation, chapter 13 and 17. The Apostle John also saw visions of the beast, the empire beast, just like was shown to Prophet Daniel. Now in chapter 13, John saw this strange beast arising out of the sea. Let's look at verses 1 and 2 of Revelation 13 and look at the characteristic of this beast. Now, let me read Revelation 13, verse 1. John said, "Then I stood on the sand of the sea, and I saw a beast arising out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his horns 10 crowns, and on his head a blasphemous name." So what John saw was this beast has 7 heads and 10 horns. Let's continue to read verse 2. Now the beast which I saw was like a leopard. His feet were like the feet of a bear, and his mouth like the mouth of a lion. The dragon gave him his power, his throne, and great authority. So this beast, it has the semblance of a leopard. And then its feet is like the feet of a bear. And then its mouth is like the mouth of a lion. Now the name of this beast sounds familiar, right? Because recall Daniel also saw this beast, the leopard, the bear, and the lion. So now, in this complex beast, it has a body, it has 7 heads, and then 10 horns. So first, we want to look at the body and let's focus on the body of this beast. Now, let me put on the screen this, what we call table that we looked at it already in the previous video. Now, as John said, has described the complex beast, right? He says the beast is like a leopard. Now, the leopard we know represents the Greek Empire. And then John said the beast is the feet of the beast is like a feet of a bear. And we know the bear represents the Medo-Persian Empire. And then he says the mouth of the beast, the complex beast, is like the mouth of a lion. And we know the lion represents the Babylonian Empire. So in this, when we were looking at Daniel chapter 7, we were also told that there is this dreadful beast, which represents the Roman Empire. And we pay particular attention to Daniel 7 verse 11 and 12. In verse 11, we were told that this dreadful beast, right, representing the Roman Empire, was destroyed. And then the body given to the fire to be burned. And we already learned that what this means was this Roman Empire came to an end finally in the year 1453 AD, the Roman Empire, the old Roman Empire. Then in verse 12, we were told that the rest of the beasts, that means the leopard, the bear, and the lion, their dominance was taken away from them, but their lives were prolonged for a season. So this leopard, bear, and lion, their dominance was taken away from them, meaning these empires lost their power, but their lives were prolonged. It means, what does it mean? It means that all these beasts, they were destroyed, or their dominance taken away from them. But then it's not the end of the story. They will somehow come back. They will somehow revive again. That's what we learn from these two verses of Daniel chapter 7. So, like I mentioned before, that like a tree, if you chop down a tree and left the stump behind, after some time, from the stump, the tree will grow back again. So this is showing that it comes back and revive itself. Okay. Now let me explain the significance of the beast that John saw. I want to put on this screen this picture. Now we recall that Daniel, in Daniel chapter 7, he saw this beast, right? This beast. And we shall call this beast individual empire beasts, because they are empires, right? They represent empires. So individual empire beasts. This is the lion, represents Babylon, then empire. Bear represents the Medo-Persian Empire. The leopard represents the Greek Empire, and this unnamed beast represents the Roman Empire. But then when we come over to this side, what John saw, John only saw one beast. And he told us that this beast, it has a residue of a leopard. And then the feet has a residue of a bear. And then the mouth of this beast has a residue of a lion's mouth. So in other words, these individual beasts are found inside this beast. See? Or to put it another way, this one beast encompasses all these beasts. See? So that's why we call it here, this is the corporate empire beast, while this one is the individual empire beast. Now let me give an illustration to help you understand this matter here. And that is, we shall call, give an example of a corporate company. Let's call it XYZ Group. Now in the world, there are many such big corporations like this. Samsung, Hyundai, many others, right? There are many. So this XYZ Group is also called a conglomerate. These huge companies are also called conglomerate. So a conglomerate is a parent company having multiple industry companies under its control. So they may have these various companies. Now this is just an example, right? So here I'll give example of 7 companies or subsidiaries, if you like to call it, that this conglomerate owns. They own these companies. Okay. Now let's say that they have this. They own this. They also have this company deals with industrial, meaning they have factories that produce certain industrial products. Then they also have their own plantation also that grow certain crops, certain fruits or whatever. They also own factories that produce motors, cars, trucks, or whatever. Then they also have a company that runs logistics, such as air freight or trucking and so on. And they may also own an insurance company, right? And then they may also have a company that deals with healthcare. Like, for example, they may own a hospital, right? Then 7, they may have a chain of outlets where they sell consumer products, boutiques or whatever, right? So this XYZ group, a conglomerate company, under this parent company, they run this they own these other companies. And these companies may be scattered all over the world, okay? And so for this individual company, these companies, we call them individual company Bs, right? Because we're talking about Bs here, so let's identify them as Bs, okay? So we have this industrial Bs, plantation Bs, motor Bs, logistic Bs, insurance Bs, healthcare Bs, and retail Bs. So all these 7 Bs, company Bs, are controlled or come under this parent company. You see? So this is an example that I can share with you or explain to you to explain this, what is happening here. That what Daniel saw are individual empires. What John saw is the corporate empire. That within this one beast, it encompasses all these other beasts. And mind you, this is only 4, right? 1, 2, 3, 4. But we were told that this beast has 7 heads. So 7 heads means actually 7 empires. So this is what we shall look into next. At this juncture, I would like to emphasize this point. That is, the corporate beast, not only the beast, the whole beast represents empires, but the 7 heads also represents empires. That means 7 heads means 7 empires. And then the 10 horns. The 10 horns also represent empires. So 10 horns means 10 empires or 10 kingdoms. Now we remember that when we were looking at the metallic man that Daniel saw, not only the metallic man represents empires, but each part of the metallic man, the head, the chest, the belly, and the legs, each part also represents empires. So this is something you must remember as we continue with our study. Now I will be highlighting or looking at a few verses in Revelation 13 and 17 to explain what they mean. So we'll be going back and forth between Revelation 13 and 17. So let me put on this first slide. On this slide, I've listed here the few verses, Revelation 13, verse 1 and 3, 17, chapter 17, verse 3, 7, 9, and 10. These few verses mention heads, either head or heads. So we will on this slide we ask this question: the corporate empire beast has 7 heads. What do they represent and why 7? This question is based on verse 10, Revelation 17, verse 10. Now let me read this verse. John was told that there are also 7 kings. There are also 7 kings, meaning that the 7 heads represent 7 kings. So each head represents a king or an empire. So the 7 heads represent 7 kings or empires. Now if you look at this list of empires here, notice that this number 3, 4, 5, and 6, this Babylonian Empire, Medo-Persian Empire, Greek Empire, and the Roman Empire, they were shown to Daniel. which we already went through this, right? But added to this list are number 1 and 2. That is the Egyptian Empire and the Assyrian Empire. Now, why? We noticed that you need to know is that the Babylonian Empire wasn't the first empire that impacted the Jews. The Babylonian Empire wasn't the first one that impacted the Jews or influenced the Jews or involves the Jews, whatever word you want to use, okay? Actually, it is the Egyptian Empire that is the first empire that impacted the Jews. You recall that Joseph was made prime minister of Egypt by the Pharaoh. And during the time there was a severe famine. So Joseph's father, Jacob, moved all his family members, about 70 of them, moved them or migrate them to Egypt. So they all settled there. The Bible tells us they lived there for 430 years until the day Moses was sent to lead them out of Egypt. So clearly, the Egyptian Empire was the first empire that impacted the Jews. Then, after the Egyptian Empire, arose the Assyrian Empire. And you recall in the time of Prophet Elijah and Prophet Elisha, the Assyrian army, they came and attacked the Israel. And in fact, they managed to capture the 10 tribes, the northern tribes of Israel, 10 tribes, and took them all as captives to Assyria. So from here, we see that there are actually this list of empires that has impacted the Jews. Okay. Now let's go back and read verse 10 again. It says, there are also 7 kings. 5 have fallen, and one is, and the other has not yet come. And when he comes, he must continue a short time. Now, John was told that 5 has fallen. What is the meaning? You must understand that the Apostle John, he lived during the time of the Roman Empire. So from his perspective, right, from his perspective, he was told by the angel that 5 of the empires have fallen. The Egyptian, the Assyrian, the Babylonian, the Medo-Persian Empire, and the Greek Empire have fallen. That means they have already passed. Then John was told, one is, present tense. So the one is the present empire that is ruling at the time of the Apostle John, which is the Roman Empire. One is, which refers to the Roman Empire. And then he say, and continues to say, and the other has not yet come. That means the next empire has not yet come, referring to the revived Roman Empire. So from John's perspective, the revived Roman Empire is still in the future, has not yet come, it's still in the future. But of course, today, the revived Roman Empire is already here in our time. But from John's perspective, it was still in the future. So John was told that when this one has come, he must continue for a short time. So this revived Roman Empire will be for a while, okay? Now let's look at another question, another verse. And this is from Revelation chapter 13. So let me put on this slide. On this slide, we have this question. One of the 7 heads was wounded, and was healed. Which head or empire was it? This question is derived from Revelation 13 verse 3. So let me read Revelation 13 verse 3. And I saw one of his heads as if it had been mortally wounded, and his deadly wound was healed. And all the world marveled and followed the beast. So Daniel was directed to look at the 7 heads. Okay, directed to look at the 7 heads. And then he saw one of the heads. One of the head was wounded, and then it was healed. Now, we already said earlier that these 7 heads represent 7 empires. There are 7 kings, they represent 7 empires. So if you look into these 7 heads, the 7 empires, which one was wounded and then later was healed? We recall that in Daniel's vision of the individual empire beasts, we were told that the Roman Empire was slain. See? So in other words, wounded, was slain. So this 4th beast, the dreadful beast that represents the Roman Empire that Daniel saw, was slain and the body given to be burned. And then it lost which means it lost its dominion. In the year 1453 AD, it came to an end, the old Roman Empire. But we learned that about 500 years later, the old Roman Empire came back as the revived Roman Empire in 1948. So the question then to this, the answer then to this question, one of the 7 heads was wounded and was healed. Which head or empire was it? The answer is the head that represents the Roman Empire that was wounded and was healed. Next, let's go back to Revelation 17 and look at another verse. Let me put on the screen this next slide. Now, this question we ask, the beast died and was revived, was, is not, and yet is. Which empire is it? Now, this question is based on Revelation 17, verse 8. Okay, let me read verse 8. John was told, the beast that you saw was and is not, and will ascend out of the bottomless pit and go to perdition. And those who dwell on the earth will marvel, whose names are not written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, when they see the beast that was and is not and yet is. Now, in the previous slides, we saw that John was directed to look at the 7 heads in Revelation 13 verse 3. But in this verse, in Revelation 17 verse 8, in this verse, John was looking at the beast, the body, right? So John was told that the beast that you saw was and is not. What is the meaning? The meaning that it had disappeared. The beast disappeared. But then it will come out of the bottomless pit, meaning it will be revived. See? And then he was told that this beast will go into perdition, meaning it will be destroyed finally. So this beast, John was told, when they see the beast that was and is not and yet is, meaning that this beast still exists. So it disappeared, it came back and still exists. So this reminds us of the Roman Empire. After it was destroyed, came back as the revived Roman Empire in the Daniel's vision. Now, in earlier slide, when we look at Revelation 13 verse 3, Daniel was focusing on the 7 heads. Whereas in this verse, he was focusing on the beast. You see? So, and it seems to be referring to the same thing. It's referring to the same thing, but it is being expressed in a different way. You see? It was expressed, this same situation of the revived Roman Empire being destroyed, being removed, being injured, then it was brought back. It's actually the same incident, but it's viewed from different perspective. So please take note. Let me repeat. From Revelation 13 verse 3, John was focused upon the heads. Now remember, a beast with 7 heads. 7 heads tells us where the head is, where the brain is located, right? So it means that 7 head represents the 7 empires. That beast represents 7 empires. So John was directed to focus on the heads in Revelation 13 verse 3. But over here in Revelation 17 verse 8, John was focusing on the body, the beast. See, the beast, the body, right? Let's go to the next verse. On this slide, we ask the question, what the 8 refers to. This question is derived from Revelation 17, verse 11. Let me read this verse. The Apostle John was told, the beast that was and is not is himself also the 8th, and is of the 7, and is going to perdition. Notice that this phrase, the beast that was and is not, appears again. Didn't we look at this beast that was and is not in verse 8 earlier on? Let's go back to verse 8. So in verse 8, we were told that the beast that you saw was and is not, and we identify it or determine it to be the Roman Empire. This beast that you saw was and is not, we determine that it is the Roman Empire. But here again, in verse 11, this beast was mentioned again, and it is with the Roman Empire. It seems that the Bible wants to give us more information about this Roman Empire. So the verse goes on to say, the beast that was and is not is himself also the 8th, and is of the 7. See? Now let me go back to the slide, this slide, which we looked at earlier. So the beast that was and is not is the Roman Empire. And the Roman Empire is the 6th head. 6th head. And then the verse says that he himself is of the 8th. He himself is also the 8th. That means the 8th head. the Antichrist, and is of the 7 head, the revived Roman Empire. So let me go back to the slide for verse 11. The beast that was and is not refers to the 6th head, the Roman Empire. Is himself also the 8th head, the Antichrist Empire, and is of the 7th head, the revived Roman Empire. Now, look at this note here. There are 2 points that I want you to take note of. The first is the Antichrist must come from the Roman Empire. Now, we will be looking into detail about this when we look at the 3rd track that is based on Daniel chapter 9. In Daniel chapter 9, we are told about the 70 weeks prophecy of Daniel. So when we study that, we will understand that the Antichrist must come from the Roman Empire. But isn't it true, by looking at this slide again, right, that the beast that was and is not is the Roman Empire? And verse 11 tells us that this beast is himself also the 8th, the Antichrist. See? So in other words, the Antichrist comes from the Roman Empire. It comes through the revived Roman Empire. And then it appears and set up his own empire. Now, why do I say that it is the Antichrist empire? Why is it an empire? Well, this takes us to the second point. That is, as the 8th head, it attains the status or authority of an empire, similar to the other 7 heads, except that the Antichrist empire will have only one king and will only last 7 years. Now, there are 7 heads, and the 7 heads represent 7 empires. But now comes the 8th head. So the Antichrist jump on board. And as the 8th head, it attains the authority and the status of an empire. But the difference between the Antichrist empire and the rest of the empire is that the Antichrist empire will only have one king. That is the Antichrist himself. And also the empire will last very short only, 7 years or less than 7 years. So, and this Antichrist empire will also be different from the other empire in that the Antichrist empire will be global. As we already look at in the previous video, that when the Antichrist appears, the world is divided into 10 regions. So when the Antichrist appears, the 10 regions of the world will receive their kingdomship, right? And then they will then pledge their authority, their support to the Antichrist. That's how the Antichrist is able to rule the world. Without the support of the whole world, the Antichrist will not be able to support the whole world. To rule the whole world. So regarding this matter, we already looked at in the previous video based on Revelation 17 verse 12. That means the verse that is just after this one, verse 12. We are not going into detail with this again. You got to look at the previous video, okay, for this. So at this point, I would like to end. And for the next video, I will be looking at the other verses of Revelation 13 and Revelation 17. Thank you for watching.